of school districts to require a study of administrative reorganizations and student transportation in selected school districts and to declare an emergency.
Representative Alexander is recognized to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What this bill does is ask for a 2-year moratorium on Act 60. Act 60 is one of the things that came out of the Lakeview decision, and it specifically says that school districts with less than 350 students enrolled for 2 years in a row can be closed or consolidated. This bill would put a 2-year moratorium on closing the schools simply because of their size. Closing and consolidation is still allowed for schools that are in academic or financial distress or don't meet accreditation standards. All this does is stop schools who are being closed for no other reason than size. During this 2-year period, it will allow us time to conduct a study of the impact of Act 60 on closing schools, particularly rural schools. It would also allow us to complete a transportation study that was actually ordered by the court 10 years ago and has never been completed. We now have some school districts. Two Rivers District is 600 square miles. We have kids that are riding on the bus 3 and 4 hours a day. And you know, we've passed some legislation this session to expand our IT infrastructure around the state. It's just difficult for me to believe that there aren't other ways to address this need. But again, it's a 2-year moratorium. Schools can still be closed for other reasons. You might wonder, why do we need this? Well, we actually have a lot of schools that are impacted. They're required every year to come up with a list of at-risk schools who fall below this 350. The last one I have is in 2010. Of the 21 schools on the list, 5 of them outscored the state average on performance tests, math, literacy, and science. 5 of them outscored the state average on 2 out of 3 of those categories. Another 5 outscored the state average on all 3 of those categories. And many of these schools are also not in any financial distress. Probably the poster child for this is the Weiner School District. A couple of weeks ago, they voted to close Weiner High School, the state board. There was an article in the paper that some of you may have seen written by Dana Kelly. Actually, he's written 2 or 3. But I just want to read just a few paragraphs of this to demonstrate what we're talking about. Pick any education standard and Weiner scores well above the median. Graduation rate, test scores, average ACT, cost per pupil. Throw in the intangibles, thriftiness, parental involvement, local funding, community support. In 2010, the 11th grade tied for the highest literacy score in the state. Just last year, the middle school tied for the 13th highest scores overall in the state. They have a 100% graduation rate. 100% of the seniors either went to college or enlisted in military service. They have a 0 dropout rate. Above average ACT scores achieved for thousands of dollars less per student than metro schools spend. A school with a high participation in AP courses, far higher than the district seeking to close it. They have an award-winning GT program whose director recently won a national award. A school that in 126 years has never been in academic or financial distress. A school that energizes and involves parents, earns and receives support from local businesses, fosters active participation from alumni. Weiner has cut its operational costs since 2010 by 21%. The school that they would be consolidated into, their operating costs went up 6% within the same period. At the time they were consolidated, and they already have been consolidated, this is about a closing in their particular case. At the time they were consolidated, they had $1 million in the bank. The high school that they want to close is 12 years old. The high school has smart boards in every single classroom. Wiener is a Gold Star school, which means they're in the top 10% of schools in Arkansas. The only thing that they have failed to do is to keep 350 students. The second year they had 344. Now again, they're not alone. They're probably the poster child, but there are lots of other schools on the list that are not in academic distress, not in financial distress, and in many cases are performing higher than the state average. With the problems we have in education, I just don't feel like we need to be closing schools who are succeeding. But again, this is a 2-year moratorium. Schools can still be closed if they're in distress. And I appreciate a good vote so that we can study this and complete the transportation study.
Representative Kerr, for what purpose?
Question.
Please.
Representative, the stats are awesome. I wish all our schools were in the same category. Could we not give Wiener School, or could they not file for a charter status?
No.
Would that help their situation when charter schools at the same time?
Theoretically, it could help their situation. I do not believe the board that approves charter schools, which is the same board that just closed the high school with this kind of performance, would give them one. But my point is, you know, what do you have to do to be rewarded here? I mean, these are the kind of schools we should be trying to emulate, not close. Thank you.
Representative Todd, for what purpose?
Question.
You're recognized.
Representative Alexander, it's my understanding that property values have dropped in the area because of the threat of closing the school, and therefore new students are not moving in. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm told by folks in Wiener that the Chamber of Commerce gets calls every week, people wanting to move into the community. There's no housing. There's a developer who has been waiting to see what the outcome of this is before he builds more houses. He wants to build a new subdivision. But, you know, trying to get people with children to move to an area that has no school and whose kids are going to ride on the bus several hours a day is not a winning proposition. I don't have a lot of experience in small towns. I lived in a very small area for 1 year. But I know a lot of you have, and even I understand the impact on a small community when it loses its school. Sometimes that's unavoidable. It's heartbreaking, but sometimes it's unavoidable. But it shouldn't be happening when a school is outperforming 90% of the schools in the state and is not in financial difficulty.
Representative Wilkins, for what purpose? You're recognized. Representative Wilkins, may I ask you to? Yeah, there we go.
I'm sorry. Thank you. As I noticed when this was in committee, it was a very contentious committee meeting. I wasn't present for the whole thing, but I did listen to part of it and watched the back and forth. Did you bring this bill because your constituents wanted to see you do this? Is this something that your constituents are driving?
No, sir. My constituents are in Springdale, Arkansas. I don't live in a rural district. I brought this bill because I think closing successful schools only because they drop below a number is stupid, and it's wrong. And that's why I brought the bill. These are not my constituents, per se.
Okay, so no matter what size the school is, you would still use that same logic that it would be stupid to close the school, let's say if it had 75 students, even though financially that would be impossible to
That's not what he said.
I agree with you. Financially, that probably would be impossible to support. But that's not what we're talking about. A school that's in financial distress can still be closed. A school that's in academic distress can still be closed. You know, we have schools in this state, in Fayetteville, near my district. The #1 performing high school in the state is Haas Hall Academy. They're capped at 320 students. They're not allowed to grow more than that. And I don't know what had happened this year, but last year they had over 650 people wanting to get in there. Dr. Schottmeyer tells me he's got people with kids in elementary school trying to get in line. They're capped at 320, and they get the same dollars from the state, the same adequacy level as any other school. And yet, a different school that's not a charter, if they fall below 350, they have to be closed. I can't reconcile that.
Could you tell me where you would feel comfortable drawing the line?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that yet. I think we need to put this thing into a study and look at look at it in a broader way, and also see what's the impact been during this time. I think we closed 52 high schools, 39 elementary schools. What's the impact been? But I don't know what the number is. Right now, what I'm comfortable saying is, if a school is performing well academically and it's not in financial trouble, I'd be hard pressed to explain why it should be closed.
Are you aware that the possibility of this legislation passing might, in fact, put the state of Arkansas back in court, similar to what happened with the Lakeview decision?
I'm aware of the statement that that's true. I don't believe it. I was asked by Dr. Kimbrell, the first time this went to committee, it failed by 1 vote. I was asked by Dr. Kimbrell to put some different language in there, because at the time, it just said they couldn't be closed simply because, and he said, what about academic distress? What about financial distress? And then I put that in there, and then he called me back and said, well, what about accreditation? So it now reads, the state board shall not administratively reorganize a school district or school campus under this section after January 1, 2014 and before April 30th, 2015 for reasons other than academic distress, fiscal distress, or failure to comply with state accreditation standards.
So you don't know where you want to draw that line?
I don't at this point, but I don't think anybody can give you that number. I've had someone from the Attorney General's office tell me several times that according to their model, a school that drops below 350 cannot generate the revenue to provide an adequate education. And yet somehow we have a lot of schools that are actually doing that. So I don't think the number makes any sense. I'm also aware that the number originally was 1,500 students. This was when Governor Huckabee was here. And then it went to 12, and then it went to 5, and it finally passed at 350. And I suspect the reason for that was it got to the point where there were enough legislators whose districts were not affected that it could pass. I don't think it has anything to do. And in fact, research has shown that smaller schools are better for a lot of kids because they don't fall through the cracks.
You're correct about the numbers that were presented initially.
Sit down already.
And I was a part of the negotiations for that. And when the governor at that time felt that 1,500 was a good number, I too disagreed and felt that districts smaller than that could remain viable. However, at some point, it got to where we as a General Assembly had to really say, okay, what can you really consider as viable that will provide an adequate and equitable education and really financially have the tax base
Is he gonna be
that
quiet
it would
yet?
need in order to sustain that school. And somewhere that line had to be drawn. And you're correct that
That's why you have the Omnibus Act.
down,
Hello.
down, down until there were enough people.
Which one pricked
actually
you?
to support it. And so that's where the line was drawn. At some point, we have to draw a line, and so I'm just surprised, and
Obviously, he doesn't know what Lakeview really was about.
I'm just surprised that, with this legislation, that you don't have in mind what that line should be, because obviously it has to be dropped somewhere. I mean, you can't say 10 students or 12 students or a
Jeez.
district with 100 students or 103 students. Somewhere the line has to be drawn. Would you not agree?
I'm not sure. You know, what we're focusing on here are inputs. You know, there are inputs into the process. How much money do we spend per student? What size is the school? You know, there's all kinds of things. You know, are our teachers getting X number of hours of professional development? Are they accredited? There's all kinds of inputs you can look at. I'm interested in outputs. This school is performing. It's performing. There are other things that affect funding. I mean, they raised their millage. Their millage is 39.9, I believe. That's pretty high for a rural school.
Are you
Now-
aware that part of what happened with the Lakeview was that there literally were districts, including Lakeview, that could raise
you
their
write this
millage
down
to
for him?
100, and it still would not be enough money to support the school.
But the point that's germane that you just made is there still wouldn't be enough money. Apparently there is enough money here to produce a quality education, because that's what they're in
Exactly.
fact doing by every measurement we have. Also, in the case of I mentioned their millage is 3.9. The school that they got consolidated into's millage is 4.4, less than that. Still,
There you go.
they're not even paying the same millage rate. And the other school apparently doesn't have any interest in raising theirs.
Okay, so just in closing then, you don't think that somewhere there has
Where's
to be
everybody going?
a line beyond which a school cannot be fiscally sound in terms of the number of students?
You know, we can split hairs on numbers. I don't think that's what's important. What's important to me is the outcome. Is the school teaching kids? Are children successfully learning? And are we able to fund the cost of that school? If those two questions are answered, and these kids are graduating at 100%, all of them going to college or the military, I'm not terribly concerned how many students entered the high school. They're succeeding.
I appreciate you taking my questions.
You bet.
Does anyone wish to speak against the bill? For the bill? Representative Burris, you're going to speak for the bill. Representative Carter, I apologize. What purpose?
Speak against the bill.
All right, let me take a speak against the bill. You're recognized to speak against the bill. We'll come back to the speak
Carter.
fors next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be quite honest with you, if you knew the background of which I come, you would understand that I've been on both sides of this issue. And I appreciate Representative Wilkins' comments, because if you'll remember, this is a very contentious time. In fact, was not just a contentious time about the quality of schooling in the state of Arkansas, but it also became an issue of how much we're going to spend. And as you all know, there was a significant increase, and it's now run into the billions of dollars. So if we think some of these issues are issues that we shouldn't pay attention to, I can assure you these are extremely contentious issues regarding our schools. In fact, 190 of our schools are considered smaller schools. Only about 45 are considered larger schools, or even medium-sized, really. For our state, though, 190. So obviously the balance is to the smaller schools. Actually, I think Representative Alexander has the best intentions. I do not question that. I don't want anybody to think I'm here, because I don't think he has the best intentions. However, the Supreme Court set aside the reasons and how the legislature were supposed to determine adequacy. So the Supreme Court really dictated to us
Oh, they did not.
that we ought to study these issues. There are no moratoriums, folks. The legislature is to study these issues and decide what adequacy is. It is appropriate for what Representative Alexander has suggested is to be part of adequacy. There is a plan for us to do this, and if this bill fails, I can assure you from the comments of the Commissioner and others that this would be an adequacy discussion, but it belongs in adequacy. Now, before we go on, I want to correct something. It was suggested that the reports academically that are required by the court, the Supreme Court, have not been done. They have been done each year.
They have
The
not.
Department of Education has filed those reports. Now,
Well,
like many
okay.
of the reports we get, and I know all of you are in the same position, not all of them get read. But the information's there if
No,
you
it's
so
not.
choose to look at it. Secondly, I have talked to the Attorney General. I've talked to the Commissioner. I was pretty sure I was correct. But there's
This
no
man is
order
lying.
that has ever been given for us to do a transportation study.
Lie.
However, there have been a series of transportation studies.
Lie.
Now, let me tell you what the real problem is. And we've got better plans. But the problem
plan?
comes back down to money. We have a plan right now on the books that probably would be an improvement for NSL funding, NSLA funding. Now, that's not the free lunch program. That's the one that gives money based on the kids that are in poverty to assist them with experiential education. It's a couple $100 million. Not much, about 3%. Just a couple $100 million. Now, when the Senate looked at that legislation, as I said the other day, it's all about winners and losers. And guess what happened? 2/3 of our school districts lost money. 2/3 of our school districts lost money.
I'm walking out.
Now, if we put that printout in front of you here today, you would look at the school districts you represent. If they lost money, you would say, They need the money just like everybody else. It is very difficult to take money away from school districts. I illustrate this only to the point, ladies and gentlemen, that when you start to discuss this issue about how we arrived at this 10 years ago, it is an extremely complex issue, and it always gets right down to how does it affect me? How does it affect the schools that I represent? And it's going to take hours and hours of investigation and research
But
to
they're not
decide what we ought to do. And then, as we've laid out in front of all of you, because adequacy has to come back to this body. It is only then that that recommendation goes on. Now, I'll say a couple other things, and I'm going to stop on this. A 2-year moratorium actually upsets the process the Supreme Court told us we must abide by. And that is study first and then recommend and get this body to make the decision, meaning the House and then the Senate. I have no problem of studying this issue.